Before you turn a plot of land into your next big project, there's one crucial first step: a site analysis. Whether you're evaluating land for development or just curious about how real estate really works, this phase lays the groundwork for smart decision making. In this video, we'll walk through the entire site analysis process. You'll learn how to use Google to gather valuable insights about the site, why tax maps and property lines can make or break your project, how zoning and redevelopment plans shape what you can build, key things to look out for with historic properties, and how to uncover environmental issues and potential incentives early on. This is the exact process that I use when evaluating land for my own developments. If you're new here, welcome. I'm Ben, a real estate developer with 30 years of experience. I started flipping houses back in 1998, learned every trade that I could, and eventually transitioned into ground-up development. These days, I'm building mid-rise projects, and at the time of this video's release, we're developing a 70-unit building. This video is part 1 in a 5-part series on how to run a full feasibility study. So if you want the full blueprint, make sure you check out the rest of the series. Let's jump into step 1 now, the site analysis. When we're getting into a site for the first time, the first thing we do is we Google it. Naturally, like everybody else does, right? That's the first thing we start to look at is an aerial view of the property and just start digging at the site itself and what we see through Google Maps.
Yeah, it's kind of great nowadays, right? That the amount of information that's available for free online, that you can virtually visit a place without ever having to get on an airplane.
Yeah,
or if it's local, in a car, whatever it might be.
Absolutely. Back in the day, just not too long ago, we'd have to drive by the property, and you'd have to pay for a lot of things to get to know the site, as well as you can get to know it just by going on Google Maps, right?
Yeah, and here, this property, which is a site that we're developing, right? We would initially just start looking at a satellite view, the street view, just to understand what it is. What's an existing building that's there? What does the existing conditions look like? What do the neighboring sites look like? Very rough view, just to get a visual, just to understand it, because that's, it's real estate, right? So it's a really important part of this, without getting into any of the some of the initial details that we start to look into, like surveys and stuff. But I feel like very quick, this kind of gives you a very quick understanding as to what the site looks like, without ever having to get there, right? So there's so much stuff that we can do in Google nowadays, get into it's literally you're there when you're looking at it in Google View.
And one thing you got to keep in mind is that Google is a little delayed. So sometimes you could be looking at a site and there may have been some improvements on the block that are not appearing yet on Google Maps. So, you could ask a broker or someone that is in the area to just drive by and confirm a couple of things. Just like taking a screenshot of the street view of the buildings and just, letting somebody confirm what we're seeing is really true. Mm-hmm. And then if it is, then you can dig a little deeper into Google Maps and start measuring the site, using the measuring tool on Google.
Yeah, that's right. Good point. Yeah, I've done that a couple of times where when I'm trying to verify certain conditions, you can use the measuring tool to do some really quick stuff. So it comes in handy. Other stuff that I've also used in here when I'm doing this preliminary stuff is, although, this is a snapshot in time, right, at a certain point, so it could be dated. I have also occasionally in certain instances used the historic data that Google has. I'll go into Street View and drop it in a particular area, and I might want to check something as to what a site looked like, let's say 5 years prior or 7 years prior, depending on the data that's available in Google. It's come in handy to check certain things, especially if there's, in this particular case, there were new buildings that were put up, and I was trying to understand when those buildings were put up, and I was able to go into Street View, change the date, and kind of track some of the changes that happened on this specific street over time and when that occurred. So it comes in handy sometimes, and it's all great thing, it's all free for that initial analysis, right?
So then after that, we get into what's happening with the tax maps, right? Just getting to know exactly what lots we're dealing with and try to get some measurements on what the lots actually are, the way they are recorded with the city.
In our area, tax maps are something that are available that you can get. They're free. The reason why it's helpful is, when we're looking at a site, what Google Maps doesn't tell you is where are your property lines, right? You go back and you look at this particular site, you have no idea. I mean, you can kind of get a sense of it, but you don't know like, oh, hey, is this driveway with this building or this building? Or, hey, is like who owns this stuff? Where are the actual property boundaries? Where do they sit in relation to some of the neighboring sites? On this particular block, there's a lot of vacant land. You can kind of get a feel for where the lot line is, but then you don't necessarily know what the dimensions are. So in our case, there are useful tax maps that give you some preliminary information. It's not a survey, but because they're free, they can kind of be helpful to get a feel for how big is the site, how many square feet is it irregular in shape? And then you can kind of try to overlay some of the information that's on here. Like in our particular site, we were dealing with this lot 8, which is a little bit irregular, and this lot 10. And lot 9 was owned by somebody else at the time. And then that same person also owned lot 11. So there were some things that we were trying to achieve when we initially started working on this site. But this was a helpful first step to understand, we're dealing with something that's 50 feet wide, 100 feet deep, plus a little extra irregular part. There's another one that's a weird, sometimes we call these like flag lots, so like a letter shape of a flag, like a letter L. So it's irregular in shape, but this was really helpful because we kind of got the dimensions from it without having to actually hire a surveyor.
Yeah, one little trick you can do too is grab a point from the corner of the block, like you have that upper corner right there, and then you can add up the measurements where you think your lot begins, and then go on Google Street Maps and then use the measuring tool and compare it to see where these lot lines are.
Yeah.
That's if you don't have a survey. But one of the first things we do is we ask the owner of the property if they have a survey. And in this case, they did.
Yeah, they had a survey that had boundary information. It didn't have topography information, but it had boundary information. And since it was a survey, it was very accurate. You can, licensed surveyor can get you the exact property boundaries, the exact dimensions of all the lot lines. Usually, depending on the type of survey that's being done, it may have utility information. On this survey, we had hired somebody to give us extra information like topography and certain utility information like the sewer line and gas and electrical poles and overhead lines, and if there's any particular, in this case, title issues, easements, and things that needed to be overlaid onto the survey. So all that information is extremely important, I think, at this preliminary phase, because these lot lines are what determined, the area within which we can build something, right? So when we get later to a schematic phase, we need to understand what are those lot lines so we can understand what is the type of building we can build on here. How big could it be potentially? And then another thing that we ended up doing on this particular site is later on, we hired somebody to do some utility surveying. Not necessarily something that we might do as like a first step, but utilities are important because at the end of the day, if you don't have certain vacant land may not have enough utilities to support the type of building you want to build there, right? So that's like one of the initial things that usually happens in site plan phases. Because is the sewer line big enough? Is there enough electrical availability for a building of a certain size? If you have vacant land that's like in the middle of nowhere, you may be running a lot of extra utilities. In this site, we ended up doing something with utility surveys.
Yeah, and in addition to that, there were a few houses you could see we had to knock down. So knowing where the utilities are, it's very important to see what exactly you need to disconnect before you knock down the houses.
Yeah, this site had some unique things going on. There were actually utility poles in the site, and those utility poles were owned by the utility company, not the property owner. And there was also utility poles owned by Verizon, actually in the site, owned by Verizon, with things running on it, wiring running on it that were serving neighboring buildings. So those can be problems, because if you can't remove them, you have to figure out how do you relocate them, and it can affect how your building's set up later on down the line. So it's all this initial stuff, right, that we do, that we start to look for things that can affect what we can build on the site.
And there were also some sewer issues that we were dealing with in one of the houses. And when we had to knock down the building, we couldn't find where the sewer of the house was going to.
Yeah,
and we found that one of the sewer lines was going to the back of the house instead of the front of the house the way it typically is.
Yeah. It went to the backyard and it went underneath a neighboring building.
And then it went to nowhere, and we couldn't even find the end of it.
And getting information from the city wasn't even helpful, because these are 100-plus-year-old buildings that were there. And so information was scarce. And so we had surveyors come in to help us locate those type of things. So yeah, it's funky things that you run into on some of these sites.
So then after this, we look at the neighboring properties and determine what type of properties are actually there. Not just by what we see on Google Maps, but just confirming what is registered with the city. And you could see that on this particular diagram here, each shade represents a type of property.
Yeah, I think the brown ones were apartment buildings. Yeah, these red ones were smaller residential buildings. The yellow one was commercial. I mean, I think basically what we're trying to do is understand in this the directly adjacent sites and other sites that are within the block, perhaps on the street, neighboring ones, just to understand like what's there, who are the owners, perhaps how much do they pay for their site, their properties, what are maybe assessed values that are there from a property tax perspective. It's just helpful information, right? Just kind of give us a lay of the land.
And it also helps you determine how you're going to design your building so that it fits in with the neighborhood. So if, let's say, the entire area was single-family homes, and then we were to propose a multifamily building, it just wouldn't fit into the neighborhood. But in this case, you can see that there are some single families, some 1 to 4 families, there are apartment buildings. So we were looking to propose an apartment building, and we could see that it fits into the neighborhood.
One of the most important steps as part of this initial site analysis is looking into the zoning for the site. This map here, at least in the area that we operate, there are zoning maps available online. It's free. In certain cases, you may have to actually go to the city's office to look at a physical map or get information about the zoning. But in our area, all of this information was readily available online. All of the zoning information was also available to read in ordinances. That's actually, I actually find all this stuff is free, right? So to be able to read this stuff, it's a helpful way to kind of understand how zoning works for somebody that doesn't know zoning. Like all these there's a lot of different terminology, like what are setbacks? What are coverage definitions? Property coverage versus building coverage, building envelopes, density, FAR. There's so much terminology that you come across in zoning. The interesting thing is, like in our area, all those definitions are actually available to read online. You can read them. You can see like, okay, in this city, how do they define FAR? Like what is it? What is building coverage versus lot coverage? How is it different? What is a rear yard setback versus a side yard setback versus a front yard setback? And when you have funky shaped lots, some of these definitions change and they impact what you can build on it, right? So you can actually, without even having a specific site, you can look up all this stuff for free and understand what all these definitions mean, because you really do need to know what they mean in order to interpret and read the zoning. Like, yeah, we eventually, when we get to a point, we hire land use attorneys to assist us on getting entitlements. But I think for us as developers, you really have to know that stuff as a first step, just to understand what you can build on the site and whether or not that site has value or fits within our target of what we, the type of properties and developments that we like to do.
And just to go back a few years, before this stuff was available online, we'd have to go to the zoning department, ask for the zoning map, and find the zoning that we were in, and then ask them for the ordinance, a printed document, and look through it. It's all available online now, but back then it wasn't. So there could be, or I should say, you could be operating in a neighborhood where the stuff is not online. Mm-hmm. And if it's not, you just have to take a trip to the zoning office and ask them for the documents.
Mm-hmm. For the site that we're developing, it was zoned as multifamily. You're allowed to build up to 6 stories. There was no density limits. There were building envelope definitions around setbacks and, how much lot coverage you can have. So there's, very specific parameters that we had to read and understand to make sure that as we get to our later phases, like market analysis and schematic designs, that we had some context around what we can do on this site, right? So this site, it made sense. It was, a good fit for what we were looking for as to the type of sites that we like to develop. And it was very conducive to doing multi-unit, multifamily developments.
Now, this site just happened to fall in a redevelopment zone, which means that at some point the area was deemed that it was blight, and the city created a redevelopment plan for the area. And that zone happens to deal with the blight that's going on in that neighborhood.
That I feel like that's like something a little bit perhaps specific to our area as to like the methods by which they were doing the zoning through a redevelopment plan. I suspect that other cities, municipalities, wherever the zoning sits, the zoning laws, the zoning definitions sit, they may have similar concepts too. So I feel like with the city that we operate in this particular site, it's kind of had like traditional definitions of zoning as well, like, R1, single family, 2-family type zoning, or, other ones that we see like neighborhood commercial, or R3, multifamily apartment style zoning. We have like those traditional definitions, and we also have these concepts of like a redevelopment plan, which were different, but it still had similar information, right? It still defines the side yard setbacks and building envelopes and density limits, principal uses, secondary uses. Like they have things like sustainability targets they're trying to achieve, or like, what are the goals for the redevelopment plan? What are they trying to achieve as a plan for the city, and why they did a redevelopment plan? So it's all stuff that's available, and this particularly is all available online. You can read it and kind of incorporate it into that design that we do later, right? When we do schematics. It's all stuff that, like there was stuff in the redevelopment plan that talked about, we're trying to do sustainability. Like we want green roofs, or we want to do stormwater management. There may be like affordable housing provision, things like that are in there that are extremely important to when we get into that pro forma phase as we're starting to underwrite this. But all of it's all available to view online and kind of do your research and do your study.
Now, in some cases where you have just a typical zoning and there is no redevelopment plan, there could be a chance for you to work with the city to create one. If you're working in an urban setting where there's a lot of dilapidated buildings, and you're thinking of perhaps creating a redevelopment plan, there's a thing called an areas and needs study, where the city could have a study based on what they're seeing in the area that needs to be knocked down or redeveloped. And if that exists, then you can have that conversation and perhaps create a redevelopment zone specifically to what you're trying to create, so long it fits into their master plan.
That's right. Yeah. And so it's something that I hadn't didn't have as much knowledge with. I think you have more experience doing it because I think you did a area in need of redevelopment, right? You did a study before on a site.
We purchased a property in an area that was called neighborhood commercial, where you could have built 4 levels of residential over retail, for example. And that was just a typical zoning, but the area just had a lot of dilapidated warehouses, things that were run down. Some buildings were, had some arson. There was homelessness in some buildings. So we went to the city and we asked them for the areas in need. And we looked at the study and determined that we could actually take their study and deem the area in blight and create zoning specifically to that area. And now there's a big benefit to that, because you go from building let's say a 5-story building, and now all of a sudden you can go for 13, 14 stories, enhance the density, and incentivize yourself and other developers in the area to completely change the zoning and the look of an area, so that you kind of clean up the neighborhood, if you will.
Yeah, there's definitely opportunity with that. I think I'd say the benefit of doing, when we do this analysis, to understand, hey, in this particular case, we're looking at the site and we're just checking to see if there's any neighboring sites that were deemed areas in need of redevelopment plan. This site was already in a redevelopment plan, so perhaps it wouldn't have made sense to try to redefine something there. But sometimes we kind of come across sites that are located perhaps near other areas in need of redevelopment plan, or need a redevelopment, where perhaps it makes sense to the zoning that might exist there. It may not make sense, and there may be a chance to pursue something like that to help redefine it and create value through an entitlement process. I think for us in the state that we're in, and the way the laws around redevelopment plans are created, there may be certain things that exist similarly in other states or cities as well. But the underlying idea was to think around, okay, here's a site. Is it located in a place where perhaps there's a chance you could redefine the zoning? And I think that's where it's helpful. The other thing that may exist in certain areas is looking at the zoning to see if there's any kind of application around historic sites, right? So, you have a lot of experience doing historic work.
Yeah, in the area where we're at, every property in this area, we have to get what is that called? A letter of
an understanding around whether that site has certain historic relevance. Because for this particular property, there were existing buildings, and we knew the zoning would allow us to build more, but in order to achieve that, we had to demolish existing buildings. And that meant demolishing something existing that may or may not have historic relevance. So we had to go through a process, and the process has changed, at least in our area, but conceptually it's the same thing, right? You're demolishing existing building. Perhaps there's something historic about it that needs to be considered, and the city may deem something historic, or the neighborhood, or whoever kind of has that overarching authority around maintaining the historic integrity of a city or a neighborhood. So it's something that, at least in our area, we always have to consider, because where we are, you're in a neighborhood where it's an old neighborhood, and so you have buildings that are old. Maybe there's some history there that you may not even know. We've come across other developers that have gotten into projects and realized that the city tells them that they can't demolish the building.
It could be a building that a certain city official could have some attachment to, and then you have to end up preserving that building. So in order to really protect yourself, you have to get what's called a letter of significance and get the clearance that you can actually knock it down, demolish it, and get it out of the way. Because if you don't, then you have to factor that into the pro forma, into the design. We've seen buildings where you build an entire new building around a historic building, and we deal with that from time to time in some of our developments.
In our city, right, we have specific areas that are already zoned historic. So you can look, and there's a separate section in the zoning code that tells you what does that mean and the implications of it, and they can be overlaid over existing zoning. So it's very important thing to check because it has a significant impact on what we're allowed to do on a particular site when there are existing buildings, or if there's vacant land or no existing buildings.
If you're not inside a historic area, or your building is not historic, there could be neighboring historic properties. And when you have that situation, the city is going to want to have you design the building so that it fits into that historic neighborhood.
Yeah.
So it's going to impact your design. It's something that you really have to look into, because at the end of the day, whatever it is you're designing, it's going to impact the numbers and the amount of money you spend on your facades.
Yeah, and kind of comes up in that pro forma stage and the schematic stage when we're doing all the designs. But I feel like at this phase, just being aware of it and understanding is important so that you know which direction the development might head and what the site impact is.
This is a study called Incentives, which you can grab from many government websites, or you can hire somebody to do the study for you, of course. But there are different types of programs that could be available for your particular site. In this situation, we were hoping that there was that it fell into the opportunity zone, where it would open up different types of credits for us, but it didn't. It was just a few blocks away. But there are a few other things that are available, it seems.
Yeah, like we were basically across the street almost from the opportunity zone. The green area was the opportunity zone. So it was very close, but not applicable in our case. And we've run into that situation a couple of times. And obviously these things are driven by tax policy or incentive policies that may change year to year, administration to administration. But it's something that we will look into to see if there's the potential to leverage any of these incentives that might exist. So in this case, there's things like low income housing tax credits or new market tax credits, opportunity zones, CDFI. There's just so many different affordable housing financing, so many different programs that may or may not exist and that may be applicable based on where the property is located, and whether or not that has an impact on the type of funding or capital needs or the potential to redevelop, do zoning changes. It's just something that we look at, and I think you have to kind of factor it into your initial analysis. And it's an easy thing to kind of look up once you know where to look. And obviously some of these things, like some of the tax credit programs, they're extremely complicated beyond just looking to see if the site location-wise is in the right place. There's a lot of rules around whether or not you could leverage it, right? And there are guys that are pure experts on just incentive programs and tax credit programs. But at least I feel like from the experience that we have and the type of initial analysis we do, it's a quick thing just to check the location, whether or not it sits in something that could be potentially helpful from the incentive side.
So all this information that we gather, from zoning to incentives, the historic plan, everything that you see here, we gather all the information and then we take it into consideration when we're doing our market study. And then after that, we're creating a schematic design and then running the numbers into the pro forma. All that data that we're getting from here goes into the next steps that helps us ultimately get to the end result. And it's also used in the investment deck at the end.
The other thing I would add that doesn't necessarily impact, let's say, schematic design potentially, it just depends, is we kind of get into more due diligence type stuff, right? So it's not necessarily just zoning or like the physical location of the site, the address. The big things, at least in our area, big ones, environmental. There are data, at least in our area, databases available that are public. They can be very difficult to navigate, where you can look up if there's certain environmental conditions that might exist on the site, if there's historic stuff that exists on the site, or if there's things that might have happened in neighboring buildings, initial information that you can do ourselves. But then usually we will eventually hire consultants to do certain types of work. So in this particular property, we eventually got to a point where we hired somebody to do a phase one study. So, I think this is how big is it? 2,800 page PDF. So crazy amounts of information, but there's a lot of due diligence that goes behind the environmental work in a phase one. And there are obviously experts that we hire to do that work depending on where we are in this initial like site analysis phase. And, when we're going into a project, where we are in terms of whether or not we're in contract or doing initial due diligence, initial analysis, we will eventually hire somebody to do a phase one and do environmental due diligence. But all this stuff, right? There's a lot of key things and information that we need to be aware of as we're doing our analysis and research around the pro forma and the schematic design and things like that, because these things end up impacting the project. So in the case of environmental, it can clearly affect our pro forma because there may be huge amounts of contamination that is extremely expensive to remediate that needs to be factored into how much perhaps we could pay for the land, whether or not there needs to be work that's done on the site before we acquire it, something that perhaps you make the seller do. There's just so many different things that can come up through an environmental inspection that can impact the project. Fortunately for us here, there wasn't anything. The phase one study came back with really no areas of concern, nothing that was an issue, nothing that we couldn't handle at least. We knew there were existing buildings, so there's probably some asbestos, probably some other existing conditions, lead paint, things that we would have to deal with when we get to that point. But it wasn't anything that was major. There wasn't like a history of an oil spill or there are things that you see in phase ones like fireborne, is it fire sandborne maps? I forget the name of it, but those maps that the phase one consultants use to kind of look at the history of the site, they can go back like 100 years and see, hey, was there like an auto body shop there or something physically there that probably may have contaminated the site that maybe requires additional due diligence, additional investigation of certain environmental conditions. It just depends. And so this is like that first step that kind of gives us that analysis of the site and what conditions exist there. Other stuff that we'll usually do that's related to environmental are like, we'll sweep the whole site for oil tanks, right? So here we hired a company to do a GPR, ground penetrating radar study. So some guy went around and went over every square foot of the site looking for underground oil tanks, any kind of conditions that might be an issue. You could do soil testing as well. So it just depends on the site and what it might require, the area that it sits in. All of this initial inspection work kind of helps us understand what issues we could potentially run into later.
And you're right, we got lucky here on this particular site, but we've had other situations on other sites. Like for example, one building that we purchased years back, the church building that we did, we converted a building into residential condos, but the church had a leaking tank underneath the ground. And when we did the environmental study, we found that the tank was leaking, and we built that into the contract. We made the seller clean it up before we took it over, and that ended up costing about $350,000, right? So, that alone could have impacted the pro forma if we would have just purchased the property blindly. So it's very important to do an environmental study. Anything could happen. It could be an oil tank. It could be, we've seen stories of like chromium being in the ground or
lead and
there
all kinds of stuff.
We are in an area where there's a lot of backfill, historic backfill they call it, where there's a lot of lead contamination, and it costs more money to dispose of the soil. So, then you have to figure out like, okay, well, how much money is that going to cost? So what does that reduce the land basis by? So you got to take all these things into consideration.
Yeah, and then on this site, we also did an asbestos inspection because there's existing conditions to deal with. We knew it's an old building and we're going to demolish it. And so we knew that there could be the potential of that. And there was. And so we had a contractor come in and do abatement eventually. It's something that maybe we don't do very early on when we're looking at a site, but we know it's something that will have to occur at some point. And typically we'll do it before we acquire the site. But it just depends on the specific circumstances of the project and kind of where we are in the phase of a development. The other thing that we also start to look at that has become really important these days, right, are flood zones. In our area, there are certain parts that are prone to flooding. So they're in areas that, because of the definitions around FEMA and the flood maps, they are located in places that are subject to flooding, in which case, when that occurs, you're going to have to get flood insurance. So again, that's something that impacts your pro forma. It also impacts zoning, because in our area, you're not allowed to build residential apartments at ground level in areas where you have flooding. They just don't let you do it anymore, which is good, because that's the problem that you see, people building in flood areas, and then you have to get flood insurance, and then flood happens, and then flood insurance companies get overwhelmed and just creates more cost for everybody in the system. So, but again, it impacts the design of the building. It's something that you want to be aware of, because it impacts the pro forma, impacts the schematic design. It impacts a lot of things. It impacts, in my opinion, the land value, because in flood zones, you're just dealing with things that you may not necessarily want to deal with. And then obviously we're seeing changes occur where I personally worry, like I always say this, like Mother Nature, you can't beat Mother Nature. So if you're going to take the risk of building something in a flood zone, you have to be really prepared for it and know what the future holds, and rely on your consultants to understand what's that long-term, because this is real estate, right? You build a building, you're kind of expecting that building to probably last at least 100 years. And in our case, maybe as a developer, we may have a 5 to 7 year hold or an exit at a certain point, or a condo for sale have an exit. Our home buyers need to understand that too. We need to know, like, we're building something that has a longevity. So we need to know where is it and what are some climate impacts like floods. And this is all easy stuff. There's so many databases available online to check things like this. They're all free. And you can get a lot of good information on whether or not it's in a flood zone, and whether or not there's certain like things like base flood elevation. Like if grade is at 4 feet and the base flood elevation is 7, that means you got potentially up to 3 feet of flooding that can occur a certain percentage of the time every 100 years. So it's all like these definitions you can look up. Fortunately for us, on this site, it's located up on a hill. There was no flood. We knew that going into that wouldn't be the case. There wouldn't be any flood risk. But this is something we always check initially. It can impact a lot of things around design. The other thing that we also like to look at, part of our initial due diligence, are title searches. We'll get a title company to do this type of initial title work, because usually they'll do it for free or for a pretty small price. And a lot of this data, since it's title, it's usually available publicly. You can look it up in a county register. In our area, the county register actually has a website. You can look it up, look up initial information yourself. But all these systems, these are hundreds of years old, right? Because these are like deeds and things that go very far back in time. And so the databases are not very easy to navigate, let's say.
How much did this cost us?
This probably would have been like $75. I don't think we paid anything actually, because for us, we have a relationship with the title company. And they know we're going to give them business, right? Like we ended up getting title insurance from them, and that's where they make their money. They're going to have to do a title search as part of that process for them. And so for them, it was not a big deal. They see it as business development, and so they do the work for us. They'll get paid. They're going to get paid eventually. And the interesting about this site, and this is where title is important, kind of this preliminary phase. This site, this land here probably goes back 200 years maybe. The deeds coming back in time go really far back. Back then, one of the properties which is now one lot, was actually 3 separate lots at one point. That's what the title search showed. And one of the lots, this funky little thing on this particular tax map sitting in the back, was actually owned by I think the city at one point. And then this probably will refresh your memory. There was a deed. There was a transfer between 2 parties, and in that deed, there was a condition that was added. And that condition said something funky like, you can't do like, I don't know, like certain types of uses, like commercial auto body type thing. But one of the words that was used was called a horizontal condominium. So that it was a prohibited use, and our land use attorney, there was no like, he did the research. There wasn't any specific definitions around that. But his interpretation in the end, and our interpretation as well, we agreed, was that horizontal condominium meant you probably couldn't build an improvement on it that was residential on this funky little piece back here. Because you could run into the risk that if you didn't see this somewhere, you could end up building a building on this, have an improvement on it that somebody later on down the line finds out, hey, you know what? There's this random deed from 100 years ago that has this condition. And we researched like, oh, what would it take to remove the condition? And since I think that condition was actually added by the city when it sold the property to the next party, and it would have required city council political approval and probably like a year of time, legal fees, all that stuff. And so we basically just decided, yeah, we're not going to build on this thing. And so that affected our, it's not even a zoning thing, right? This is not zoning. This is a title thing that ended up impacting our schematic design later. At one point, we were actually considering building on here because the zoning allowed us to build on here. Zoning said we could build on the first floor. We could do 100% lot coverage.
So we ended up using that lot right there, that little piece, for the backyards of the ground floor apartments.
Right. So we have no building on it, just landscaping. But yeah, it ended up being an important finding as part of our due diligence. This came up, not even with the attorney, this came up through the title company. The title company brought it up and told us about it. And so a boring little thing. And the interesting thing I felt like was, this is stuff that I came to learn, was our attorney that was working with us on the transaction, the acquisition, mentioned to us that sometimes you run across crazy things in these prohibited uses, some of which are actually racist. There can be racism incorporated into some of these prohibited uses because, over time, different things have changed and you get funky things that show up in title sometimes. But yeah, I feel like all this stuff is initial work that can be done that affects our site analysis and the later phases of a development. And all kinds of things show up in like your surveys and title that can be related, where you might have a neighbor that has an easement on your lot, right? That shows up in title, that affects your survey, that prevents you from perhaps building on the easement, right? So the neighbor has a special egress easement or a driveway easement or a utility easement, all of the stuff that's not zoning, but that can end up affecting your building. And then in the end, to me, it affects the land value. If you can't build on a particular part of the land, that affects, to me, it affects the land value.
Sure.
So all that stuff is really important. It's boring. It could be boring looking through these documents.
But you can get stuck. One of the biggest horror stories that I heard here in this neighborhood was that somebody had bought acres and acres of land off of a transportation company and started to develop the site and try to get approvals, and then to find out that somewhere in the deed later on, he had to give the city the opportunity to bid on the land before he bought it. Right? So the poor guy went into, he got into fights with the neighborhood, and it took him years to find out that he couldn't build on it at all. Right? So the developer just he got old, ended up dying, and the city took back the land. So he ended up losing the property. So it's so important to do the title work.
Yeah. And at a very early phase, because it's all part of the due diligence,
Yep.
all part of the work that goes into developing the site and figuring out what you can do there.
Sure. You can have a simple deed restriction that just like prohibits you from building anything on it, and then you're stuck.
Yeah, or it's stuck going through a year of headache trying to remove
Right.
it.
Spending time and money on site plans, approvals, and all that, and then you get to the end, and then you can't build on it. That's just a waste of time and money. So a lot of people don't do a lot of this work, right? Some people just will look at the survey, they'll maybe look at the tax maps, and that's it. A lot of people won't go through environmental sometimes, or they won't dig into the title search as deeply as we do. So I think it's important to, hit every one of these points to make sure you cover yourself and gather up all the data from all these reports, and then use them in the next steps of the feasibility study, which is the market study, the schematic design, and then ultimately a lot of these numbers end up into your pro forma and then into your investment deck.
That's right. Yeah. It's not just zoning.
It's not just zoning. It doesn't
everybody
stop
thinks
there.
development is just zoning, but it's not. It's a key part of it, but it's not just zoning.
By taking the time to do the site analysis and understand the site up front, you're already way ahead of most developers. Now it's time to move on to step 2, the market study. In that video, we'll break down how to evaluate demand, analyze the competition, and make sure your project actually makes sense for the area. Just click right here on the screen to keep watching. And if you found this helpful, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the rest of the series. I'll see you in the next video.